Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to thank Julie and Sean and everybody at the Big Read. I've been just very fortunate to have been part of some of these big reads before with Station 11 and Fahrenheit 451. And in fact, we had the whole school where I'm coming from read that Fahrenheit 451 throughout the whole year. And I really believe in the mission of the Big Read. I believe that my daughter once, when she was 10 years old or so, and we were talking about the Big Read, and she said that it's really fun to read books at the same time. She said, we get to feel the same things in the same order. And there's something just deeply connective and hopeful about such an enterprise. And I'm speaking to you from a school, Northfield School of the Liberal Arts, that has as its motto, let them be born in wonder. A school that wants to read ancient texts and then make something of the questions that come, just like Madeline Miller did. Whether that takes the form of another book or an essay or a painting. We want to inhabit the past more fully so that we can inhabit the present moment more fully and make choices that will benefit the future. We believe with Christian Wyman, who was the editor of poetry for a while, and who, when he was there, he said that we go to poetry, and I would say maybe mythic space or even the past in a kind of mythic or poetic sense. We go there so that we might more fully inhabit our lives and the world in which we live them. And if we do those things, we might be less apt to destroy both. And that's what we're up to here at this school. It's something that I learned. And one of the people I learned what I just described to you from was one of my mentors, Jeanine Hathaway, who you see on your screen. And that word, of course, has so much mythic resonance. And I get to appreciate her more by virtue of reading myth. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about is the power of myth. And I'm going to share my screen now to show you just kind of an outline of what we're going to be doing. So we'll be talking about the art of reinvention, and we'll be breaking it down into the essential questions that we put in the intro to what we were going to be up to tonight. We'll be speaking in terms of what moves an artist to reinvent the past, what moves are common to great reinventions, how is it that ancient figures can speak to and in our time, and what is it that makes reading myth so powerful? What can it do? So those 4 questions are we're going to explore together, Jeanine and me and you. And we'll be talking about different acts of reinvention, of course, Circe, but also other works that kind of fit the same description. And we're speaking in terms of reimagining, but also reinvention. That's the word we're finally going to land on. You'll hear us both talk about reinvention. And that word etymologically comes from the Latin invenio, which means to discover, to come upon. And then later it becomes associated with a making. So you'll hear us both talk about that kind of how great reinventions are acts of discovery, are acts of expanding what you have found, and often using ancient tools in order to shed more light on a past story, and therefore shed more light upon the present moment that's built upon it. So I'm excited about getting into all of this, and I want to turn things over to Jeanine. We're going to start addressing this first question about what moves an artist to reinvent the past. And again, I just want to just say how lucky I feel to be in this same space with a mentor to me in poetry and in life, Jeanine Hathaway.
So welcome to the Mutual Admiration Society here. And get right into it. What moves an artist to reinvent the past? Let's say it's at least 2 things. Oh, I should tell you, a woman of a certain age needs a script. Bill can ad-lib, but I'm going to read to you. Let's say it's 2 things. at least. Dissatisfaction and curiosity. Dissatisfaction with the present. How did we get to this point as an individual, a family, an institution? Maybe we traced our ancestry and hit a wall, or we traced our ancestry and didn't like what we discovered, or our father didn't like what we discovered. We might ask at that point a cliffhanger of a question that begins, what if? And you can supply your own alternatives. You can imagine a few, you can write them down. In our book, Circe, on page 282, Circe tells Trigon, whose tale has just been basically offered to her. Circe says, I cannot bear this world a moment longer. And Trigon, as he is lifting his wings and gliding away, says to her, then, child, make another. And in that language, he gives her her vocation. Another prompting question about being dissatisfied with the present is to start the question, well, why not? And then see it another way. Is it possible to simplify the problem, the cause of our dissatisfaction? And one way to simplify is to exaggerate, to make the situation and the people larger than life as we know it. Make everything and everyone archetypal. Tell the story that way. Consider who might be the ruler, the sage, the messenger, the sneak. Consider archetypal places, the forbidden room, the shrine, the grove, the hideout, the candy store. Neil Williams, in his most recent novel, This Is Happiness, writes, we all have to find a story to live by and live inside, or we wouldn't endure the certainty of suffering. For an example of an archetypal story, say it starts, I'm little, I'm unimportant, my voice is weak, I don't like the way my relatives treat each other. My father thinks he's such a big shot. All my viciously alluring mother cares about is her looks and her enviable jewelry. My sister and brother tease me and make fun of the things I'm interested in. They keep me out of their games, but I have seen something they don't know I saw. And this is how Circe's story begins, with these archetypal figures. I'll move into memoir writing because that's also telling our own story from our own point of view. Memoir writing became popular about 30 plus years ago for the masses, for ordinary people, not just celebrities and political figures doing their autobiographies, but ordinary people who wanted to understand their own lives. In objectifying, one can write it all down. And we can see ourselves as a central figure. It's therapeutic for some. For others, we need therapists. It's helpful as a defense, an apologia, setting the record straight, even getting a little revenge. If we're writing about ourselves, but we don't want others to know it's our real story, then we tell it in the third person point of view and call it fiction. That lands then somewhere between memory and myth. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I love how you're bringing out the idea of mythic space as this exaggeration where we can see ourselves writ large. And that's something I think will come up when we talk about the power of myth, but just, it feels True to the scale of the emotional experience. We're not just lonely, but we're on an island. You know, we're not just like coming to an awareness of our possibility in a given craft, but we're like touching this plant and it buzzes in us, and
Yeah.
it feels true to what it feels like. But then also, as you're saying, we can identify ourselves more clearly if it's so clearly and largely defined on a big screen, or the big screen of our mind as we're reading, and we can see ourselves more clearly as people capable of more than maybe we thought. And that connects with that quote that you had about finding a story we can live in.
Mhm.
I agree. The impulse is dissatisfaction and curiosity, and I think sometimes that takes the form in many great reimaginings or reinventions. That dissatisfaction and curiosity about not seeing yourself in the past, or in the story we're telling about the past, or the story that's come to us about the past. And I think we all have this sense that how we see our past, personally or culturally, is shapes our understanding of our possibilities in the present, the kind of range of motion we believe we're capable of. It's the story of our past that informs that individually or as a culture. So I think that's part of what would cause someone to want to reinvent, to find more in the past, to find this story we can live in.
Mhm.
Um, I found it interesting. I read an interview with Madeline Miller that chimed with something that we've been studying this week in our science class. What I mean is, it seemed to me from this interview that she had a question about what she saw in the past. So sometimes we have a question about the past. Why is it that Cersei is depicted the way she is? Why are witches just depicted as old and haggard? Why are nymphs also often being predated upon? And to investigate those questions, explore those questions in whatever craft you've come to in your life. For Miller, it's writing. And this is the same thing a scientists do, is what I was trying to get to. We've studied these experiments, and a scientist will have this question that he wants to explore, he or she, and creates this creative and thoughtful experiment. And Miller creates this kind of experiment, if you will, and probes that question. What I read in the interview in part is that she felt when she was reading the Odyssey, which she loves, is she felt certain that Cersei represented a kind of anxiety about female power. And so why is that anxiety? And so probing that
Hold on.
is
I can't hear. Come on.
is kind of a, but and then maybe another way of why we explore the past and why we want to reinvent is that we relate to a character in the past. And maybe all these things are true for Madeline Miller, but I think, for example, of Greta Gerwig and her reimagining of Little Women a couple years ago in the movie that she made, where she foregrounds Jo as an artist, and it's the story of the development of an auteur, like a young woman with agency, and finds her craft, and the inflection of the story is toward that story. It's bookended by her story. It ends with the book being born on the printing press, preparing to take on independent life beyond the artist. And it's like Greta Gerwig's movie, or Lin-Manuel Miranda reading John Meacham's book about Hamilton and feeling a kinship with this ostensibly remote character. And then so what accounts for this kinship? And you want to explore that more. And I think in the end, a lot of these, for me, from my reading of it, is these reinventions often are acts of love, not only for the source material, but for us in the present. We want to go back to these historical spaces, inhabit them more fully, expand them, look at the margins, those voices that are undervoiced, and voice them, expanding our view like a mural, like expanding, or taking a 2D painting and making it a 3D rendering, something we can really look all around, and it casts a shadow and we can cast our shadow on it. We can understand it more. So I see Miller's book as this act of love that sends us back to reveal more of the picture. And in that way, it's very radical. It's a radical re-understanding, but the word radical means to challenge our conventional way of seeing, but the word radical at its root means it's rooted. So it's an ancient kind of way of seeing. And so she takes us to the past and often uses tools that we'll get to next that are ancient in order to increase our understanding of what's there and increase our range of possibilities, therefore, in the present.
Okay.
So the next question that we're going to be exploring is what moves are common to great reimaginings or reinventions.
Well, the most obvious is to change the point of view, or to assume a point of view that's not the one that's the given. And in 16th century Spain, a religious practice began, Ignatius of Loyola, for those who love the Jesuits. A religious practice began by imagining oneself in a biblical scene. The exercise suggests you be among the crowds following a prophet, be the sycamore tree in a scene of a man climbing that tree for a better view, and then meditate on your presence there. And you would go there because you loved whatever it was you were reading. So you would go to it as yourself, but put yourself in that scene. Meditate on your presence there and feel it in your body. People talk about when you're anxious, where do you feel it in your body? And we don't need to talk about where you feel love in your body, because that's everywhere. But in this case, for changing a point of view or assuming a point of view that's not from your own life, you pull it into your body and meditate on your presence there. And those exercises test a reader's tolerance for disorientation, which I think is pretty great, because then you don't have to stay in the predictable present. You test your own tolerance for disorientation. If we can surrender to the scene, suspend our disbelief, we can be hooked into a vicarious life. Our minds, and this is, I believe, true, our minds can't tell the difference between imagination and reality. Because note, when you read something scary, our heart rate goes up. And if we're reading something that's tragic, we shed real tears. But that's what publishers love, is a page turner. You can't put it down. You're hooked. Your whole physical self, physiologically, we experience the situation as if it's our reality. And that allows us catharsis. And catharsis may open us to something like compassion. Now, using a figure from the myth that we've just all been entertained by, Alicia Stallings, who is a contemporary poet and translator, who is American, but she lives in Athens, retells a myth from the point of view of a modern tour guide. And this is called Tour of the Labyrinth. The tour guide has revised the myth, either because he didn't remember that Theseus had killed the Minotaur, or because he felt sorry for the Minotaur's violent death. He'd rather have the death be by neglect than overt violence. And I think he's also way too much in love with his own version of this, but that's, never mind. Tour of the Labyrinth. So he's talking to his tour group. And they're underground, some think under the palace of Knossos in Crete. And this is where they kept it, though their own, hungry in the dark beneath the stair, and fed it apple cores, the odd soup bone, and virgins with their torches of gold hair. When howls were heard, they claimed it was the earth, subduction of a continental plate, put down their sherry glasses with thin mirth, excused themselves and said that it was late. But when the earth did make a mooing sound, stones that had been stacked into the wall knelt to the embracing of the ground. Amid the gravity that struck them all, no one thought to go unlock the door. Archaeologists, amazed to find a skeleton they were not looking for, said it was the only one of its kind. They've unraveled the last days of the thing. It lived a while on rats and bitumen and played with its one toy, a ball of string, to puzzle out the darkness it was in. This is one shifting point of view, and this is a very short list of some modern poets who have reimagined myths. And of course, I keep remembering others that I should show up on this list. Anne Carson, the autobiography of Red, and Red Doc, and she's coming up with a new one that's going to be a graphic novel on the Trojan women. But these, Alicia Stallings, any of her collections of poems, Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad, Anne Sexton doing Transformations, which are fairy tales. Among many of us who have daughters, Persephone and Demeter are favorites. Louise Gluck, Aventura, which is the name of an Italian town thought to be the mouth of Hades. Rita Dove's Mother Love, Alice Oswald. And I don't need to read these at you, but if you know how to do a screenshot, you can just take a picture of all of these that give you some sense. Natalie Haynes, 1,000 Ships, that just came out this year. Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles, she did before she did our Circe. There are some nonfiction texts. Achilles in Vietnam, it was put together by Jonathan Shea, Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character. And he uses this in, or did use it, I think it's still in use for some other veterans. He examines the psychological devastation of war by comparing the soldiers of the Iliad with Vietnam veterans suffering PTSD. And if you want to watch, Theater of War does online productions in that same vein of taking myths from antiquity and making them sort of up to date. From the 80s, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, Women Who Run with the Wolves, subtitled Myths and Stories of the Wild Woman Archetype. Natalie Haynes, Pandora's Jar, Women in the Greek Myths. And I love this, the dedication to that book. For my mom, who has always thought a woman with an axe was more interesting than a princess. Now, the other way of reinventing, reinventing, is through vivid description. And I said that before with the, put yourself in the sycamore tree, that you use all of your senses. And when I was teaching writing, one of the things I would have students do is make lists, just turn a page sideways and list each of the at least 5 senses. And then right underneath each of those senses, what's happening? You know, what's the temperature? What's the light like? And are there any sounds? Do you smell anything? I remember going to Mark Twain Tonight with the late Hal Holbrook playing the part of Mark Twain, and going into the theater and smelling the cigar before we ever opened up the curtain to see Twain. So all of our senses were being engaged. And the more sensory information, the more the reader experiences the situation and becomes emotionally engaged. Miller does this in Circe, describing the horror of Prometheus's scourging, his golden blood streaming down his back and all over the ichor-slickened floor. The fact that he was thirsty, another of the senses. Circe brought him a cup of nectar, which he could not hold for himself. When we choose one detail, we take the time and focus the attention to lean into it. We explore, as Bill said earlier, explore. And speaking etymologically, that comes from 2 Latin words, explorare, which means not only what it's come to mean, to systematically check something out, it means to weep loudly or to lament. And so when you're exploring, don't be surprised if you find something that makes you very sad. Lamenting. Through exploration and lamentation, we are purged. And again, catharsis. To purge is to purify. Another example of Miller's facility with vivid detail and the pacing of her revelation is Circe's visit to Trigon. This scene mirrors psychologically the situation with Prometheus. Prometheus knew the consequences of his stealing fire from the gods, and he chose to sacrifice himself for mortals. Circe is told the consequences of taking Trigon's tail, eternal agony for her, and maybe a few extra mortal years for the son she loves. And she chooses her son's protection. Later, she chooses her own mortality for love of Telemachus, after imagining for 3 pages what might be the result of taking that potion that would turn her into her true self. After all, we saw what it did to Glaucus and Scylla. They became who she imagined they truly were. It's all a risk, this love.
Yeah, I love that so much, what you're saying. And I love that you brought forth the theater of war, which I recommend highly. It's just to reiterate, it's a group in New York that has long made a practice of performing ancient plays for contemporary audiences, particularly veterans, and finding that sometimes reinvention is just doing the play. Like just doing it now is a kind of reinvention. People will discover things in them, that kinship I was saying before. They find that when they do these ancient plays, especially the Greek plays, that were performed for an audience that was almost wholly made up of veterans, the men at least. I mean, wholly made up of veterans who have seen trauma, and they would see these great agonies and struggles writ large on the stage in front of them, and behind that is the mountains, and behind that is the sky, this cosmic significance of what they have been through. Anyway, when they do it now, they find that veterans who have not spoken of their time in Iraq or Afghanistan start to speak. Just recently, well, as the pandemic started to gain purchase, they did a production of Oedipus Rex, which it was just like this. It had actors just talking to the screen and didn't do much. There weren't costumes or backgrounds. They're just saying the words. But Oedipus Rex was written in a time of plague and in the wake of plague. Plague was a prevalent part of their life. And this is Oedipus Rex was about plague and leadership in a time of plague. And it just knocks you back.
Yeah.
Power of these ancient texts, just doing it. A theater director once said Hamlet is a sponge. It absorbs, you know, what's going on in any state, in any time that it's done in, because it gets at something just very essential. And I also like that, Jeanine, you brought out that Stallings poem where our sympathies ultimately lie with the monster.
Yeah.
And that's very much like Cersei, and I mean, and I know that's why you chose it, and at least in part, our sympathies lie with this monster who did not choose the coupling of its parents, and just by that point of view shift, which extends our sympathies and locates our sympathies with that which otherwise would be elided or summarized or seen, looked askance at, is this radically, again, like political act. But I mean politics in that sense of the polis, the community. And so to inhabit the consciousness of those whose consciousness is being ignored or maligned or just like summarized or made one ply for some reason, by allowing us to inhabit that consciousness, it extends our sense of what a community is. So it extends our political nature, and it even allows us, almost by definition, to take on more humanity by inhabiting these different points of view, and therefore maybe makes us more human if we're taking on more of what it means to be human. And that, of course, is the story of Cersei. Like, she's becoming, it's a creation story of becoming human. And so I think that radical choice in both sense of the word, challenges to our conventional understanding, but rooted deeply in the source material, is something she does all the time. She uses these ancient techniques. It might seem radical to have a story from the point of view of Cersei, but as Jeanine was just saying, it's a practice that has long been inhabited to do that, and it's one of the oldest moves in antiquity. Virgil used it, the Aeneid, which a lot of Western civilization is built on. It's a founding document of Western civilization, is a reworking of the Odyssey and the Iliad, as I know you know, and it's kind of a different point of view. We're following the loser of the Trojan War, the Trojans, and we're following this one guy, and as he makes his way, and the characters that are in the Odyssey and the Iliad take a sort of are moved to the background, and we foreground Aeneas. And so this point of view as a radical move is both radical because it seems to challenge us in some way, but when on closer inspection, it's a really old tool to help us see the present, which is what Virgil was up to. Mm-hmm. And just to say some more things, some more works that you might want to explore if you haven't already. John Gardner wrote a like novel from the point of view of Grendel in the Beowulf saga, from the point of view of the monster. Tom Stoppard wrote Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, where these peripheral functionary characters in Hamlet are all of a sudden, like, against their will, like you get the sense, like, brought into the spotlight and they don't know what to do. And it sheds light on the source, which you get the sense that Stoppard loves, just like you get the sense that Miller loves these ancient myths because of all of what they can do. I too have a poem to demonstrate point of view. I am mindful of time, so maybe I'll try to do it fairly quickly. But I think that this poem by Margaret Atwood, who is the author of Handmaid's Tale, that was recently turned into a TV show, obviously an amazing, amazing writer. She wrote this poem, and this is very similar to what Cersei or Miller is up to in Cersei, I think. It's from the point of view of a nymph, and this is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which again is a story that people keep returning to. There's something in it. There's many things in it, and these points of view shifts are points of entry into the story. Like, how can I understand it more? Like that religious practice that Jeanine was describing? How can I understand by inhabiting the consciousness of a marginal figure, someone else in the story? So here, this is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. This is the story where they, Eurydice dies on her wedding day to Orpheus, and Orpheus is the great, instrument. He plays the lute so beautifully that, and can sing so beautifully that as Shakespeare says, trees, stones, and floods like come to him when he starts playing. Like he's that amazing at it. On their wedding day, she dies. And this is instructive, I think, too. There's many versions of this story even back then. And so this seemingly radical move to retell a story is in the tradition. There's many different versions, too prominently, about how she dies, but she dies and she is in the underworld, and Orpheus comes down and wants her back, and Hades agrees, but only if, famously, they go up, to the mouth of the cave, but she is behind him. And if you turn around, Orpheus, even for 1 second, she will be lost to you forever. That story that's been retold many times. But Margaret Atwood enters that story from the point of view of Eurydice. And as I read it, you might hold in mind this quote that I put at the bottom from Circe. If you remember this very powerful part where she says, "My father has never been able to imagine the world without himself in it." She was talking literally about the construction of his room. It only, these great obsidian walls only are reflective dazzlingly if you have just this ton of generated light that only he has. And so if he's not there, this room is very dark. But there's a world of meaning in this sentence. And so similarly, Margaret Atwood, speaking in the voice of Eurydice, so the point of view is Eurydice, is saying, I think, something similar. So let me just, if you don't mind, I'll just say it to you. Orpheus, you walked in front of me, pulling me back out to the green light that had once grown fangs and killed me. I was obedient, but numb, like an arm gone to sleep. The return to time was not my choice. By then, I was used to silence, though something stretched between us, like a whisper, like a rope. My former name, drawn tight. You had your old leash with you, love, you might call it, and your own flesh voice, but before your eyes, you held steady the image of what you wanted me to become, living again. It was this hope of yours that kept me following. I was your hallucination, listening and floral, and you were singing me. Already new skin was forming on me within the luminous, misty shroud of my other body. Already there was dirt on my hands and I was thirsty. I could see only the outline of your head and shoulders black against the cave mouth, and so could not see your face at all when you turned and called to me because you had already lost me. The last I saw of you was a dark oval. Though I knew how this failure would hurt you, I had to fold like a gray moth and let go. You could not believe I was more than your echo. So it's one of these, very challenging poem, powerful poem, but I think it doesn't diminish our appreciation of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice to consider this. It doesn't destroy the myth. It makes it more full and expands our consciousness of what it means to live in a mythic space, which is one of the next things we're going to explore. I think I'm going to stop there. I don't want to go over our time here. Hold on one second, I'm negotiating Zoom. Okay, yeah, so why don't we move on to this next question about how is it that ancient figures like Circe can speak so eloquently in and to our time?
My response to that is pretty much what we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes. But I will soldier on with my script. She's learning how to be one of us. What does that mean? That a goddess, a sorceress, has the power she has, and yet chooses to forgo them, to sacrifice the known for what she can only imagine. Her imaginings are based on observation, but it's still a gamble because she's putting herself in chronological time. She will die. And so before she drinks that potion, which she invented, she envisions a scene, envisions scenes of a mortal life with Telemachus, thereby magnifying and uplifting for the reader what is marvelous and meaningful about being human. The clarity of that boundary is death. As humans, we have a deadline. And just to say, we just celebrated Ash Wednesday and were reminded, thou art dust, and unto dust thou shalt return. I'll close my part with a quotation from a writer, Belden Lane, who wrote, "An opening framed by closure is the first requisite to a sense of the sacred."
Say that again.
An opening framed by closure is the first requisite to a sense of the sacred.
Yeah, I mean, that's what gives this story for me such, part of what gives it power is that choice to be bounded in time, like you're suggesting, the opening and the closure, and that, and what motivates that. And I think that's part of why it speaks so eloquently in our time, because certain dynamics, certain themes, certain ways of feeling, are shared across time. And one of the things I wanted to show in that regard is the idea that we have different names for the same phenomenon. Right now, we would say this we would call it flow state. When we're entering a flow state, we are really, in tune with the materials of our craft. And as I say here at the top, this kind of expansive, self-dissolving experience of flowing into one's purpose. Time, seems to disappear, becomes more expansive. We all have experiences with that in whatever craft or whatever something we're doing. We enter this, we call it flow state up here, way up here at the top of where these roots and branches grew. But that same thing was experienced by the ancient Greeks, and then it's, of course, experienced by Madeline Miller's refinding of those ancient Greek stories and expansion of it to include Circe in the story. But I just wanted to, it struck me that that this part here, Madeline Miller, she says in Circe's talking, of course, "I thought of the humming I had heard when I touched those flowers, the eerie knowledge that had glided through me." And then later she refers to it, as I alluded to earlier, like there's this buzzing in her. There's this expansion of awareness when she is touching the materials of her craft. And in many ways, I read Circe as this story of a liberal artist becoming an artist with agency. And it reminded me of this part from an old Sophocles play, Philoctetes. This is a reinvention by Seamus Heaney here in our day. This is a play that's gained purchase in our consciousness recently because Lin-Manuel Miranda quoted from it. Biden has quoted from it. It was used in the peace accords, in the Irish peace accords in the 90s, this play. So it still speaks. But listen to this. This is this mythic archer, Philoctetes, and he's talking about when he touched the bow, similar to Cersei touching these flowers. I love the feel of it. Its grip and give and the grain that was seasoned with my sweat. When I held it, I had a hold on the cross beam of the world. I was the wind and the trees and the pillar of Hercules. I mean, that's flow, right? Like these things don't change. And it gives us hope in many ways. Seamus Heaney is the same guy who said, like, reading ancient texts gives you coordinates. Someone else has been in the same sort of state, if you will, that you've been in. And it can give you hope, and it can give you a sense of purpose even in your life, and give you a range of options. I also think the theme of becoming more human by becoming aware of suffering and exercising imagination in order to make you more compassionate and feel with others is a very powerful theme in any age. Yes. You know, I think one of my favorite is a strange way of talking about it. One of the most powerful moments for me in this whole book is when she learns about the astronomers and the fate of these astronomers who, through no fault of their own, in fact, because of the caprice of Helios, are wrong about their findings, and then they're killed. And Helios sort of, you know, says it very casually, but she imagines their fate. And this is early in the book that shows you this power of imagination. She imagines their bodies sprawled across the marble floors, and it kindles. She sees Prometheus, and she transgresses by bringing him the nectar. She's her powers of imagination and her connection to those who would sacrifice in order to bring a more flourishing into the human world. You know, she starts to feel her blood within her. She feels pain. Imagination feels strange to her at first, but then she keeps exercising it. She knows what comes of those who sacrifice. She saw Prometheus hanging, silent and alone, a gash opening on his side, but she still chooses to sacrifice. We're drawn to that story that recurs. That's the hero's journey. That's the story circle that is taught at Pixar. You know, it's the same story. And family dynamics also, to go back to your point, Jeanine, about memoir, like you can see yourself and your family dynamics writ large in Cersei, especially that opening, you know. And so it's a powerful story because it desires to allow the human world to flourish more, and our innate, intuitive, archetypal understanding of the sacrifice that's required to help others flourish is never old. It is never, ever old. And so that's, to me, part of what makes it still resonant. So our final question is what makes reading myth so powerful?
We come to Greek myths with a kind of commercial familiarity with the gods by their names as products. Ajax cleaners, Nike shoes, Hermes or Hermes luggage and scarves. FTD florist delivery logo is Mercury. Amazon. But then the first sentence of this novel is, when I was born, the name for what I was did not exist. And with that sentence, we, as Bill just pointed out, we lost our familiarity. There wasn't a name for what she was. So here we go. The first statement is going to test a reader's tolerance for disorientation. This is from Clarissa Pinkola Estes's book. Stories set the inner life into motion. And this is particularly important when the inner life is frightened, wedged, or cornered. Story greases the hoists and pulleys. It causes adrenaline to surge, shows us the way out, down, or up, and for our trouble, cuts for us fine, wide doors in previously blank walls, openings that lead into that dreamland, that lead to love and learning, that lead us back into our own real lives. Miller shows us how radical transformation is the choice Circe makes, following the example of Prometheus, becoming an example for her readers. And Richard Rohr says, Jung goes so far as to say that transformation only happens in the presence of story, myth, and image, not primarily through rational arguments. Now, I have something written out, but it's not, I don't think we have enough time for me to read this. But I just want to say about how reading the myths influences even a daily, really quotidian sort of event. Last week, and this could all be in, capital, all the nouns could be in capital letters. Once upon a time, an elder, a woman of a certain age, appeared for her appointment at the long-awaited vaccine. I will read it. The north entrance was blocked. She'd walked to the south, for every story requires a sacrifice, at a wind chill below zero under a late afternoon gray sky. The south door opened onto myriads of elders, each exposing a sensitive wrist to a yellow machine that let them progress into a place in the slow queue, snaking back and forth across a lobby under enormous paintings of the heroes of the realms of entertainment. Papers exchanged for tickets. The elders shuffled to the mouth of the tunnel, each bundled and masked, undifferentiated, hunched over their walkers, leaning on canes and their assistants. Neon vests monitored movements, each vest more important, gaining. Out the other end of the tunnel into a cavern lit dim as the underworld. The woman was pointed toward table 5, where sat the keeper of the syringes. Ticket surrender, upper arm bared, pop. The vaccine was now inside her. Off to the holding area, one among the many, for their quarter hour, then motioned to a corridor where blue-suited security gestured to the only exit. Knowing the place to be where she had entered, the woman stepped outside, still herself, only different. That's why I read myth. It enlarged in-trust arena.
I think that's a great place to end. I mean, that's exactly the power of myth, being able to see that. And maybe at this point, if there's still time, Julie, we could have some questions.
Sure.
Or
We
Sean.
have we have a statement and then a question, but first, Bonnie says, I would love a copy of Jeanine's vaccine story. It so completely described my experience. Thank you. The comment we have is, you see the reinvention of the stories of the biblical Lilith, who historically was demonized, but today she is more liberated and given more female feminist power. So do either of you care to comment on that?
Well, I remember when Anita Skeen and I were still teaching together at Wichita State, so maybe in the late 70s. And I am blanking on the name of the woman who, with Anita, wrote a book of poems based on the Lilith figure. And I don't know, there are probably, somebody's probably written an opera using Lilith. I know Children of Eden, Stephen Schwartz's, but Lilith doesn't appear in that. Eve is still the one who is, it's not that she wants to be disobedient, but she is drawn in a song called Beyond. What she wants to know what's beyond the walls of Eden. And in that, in that play, musical, there's a line, you cannot close the acorn once the oak begins to grow. And that happens with curiosity, right? You open up that acorn and, oh, sister, oh, brother, where art thou?
And then we have a question that asks, so do you think that gods are in a constant flow state, and maybe when we achieve that state, we may feel more godlike?
Bill.
Well, I mean, I love that question. I mean, it makes me think of the fact that imagination, at least according to this story, is the conduit between those worlds. And so by exercising our imagination is a way to flow into perhaps that kind of perspective that the question's implying. What do you think, Jeanine?
Well, I think when we're in the flow state, we are, and I'm remembering, I forget his first name. His last name is pronounced Csikszentmihalyi. He was a professor at the University of Chicago who gave us the book called Flow. And in that flow state, we are the least self-conscious. We are fully engaged, totally engaged with whatever the thing that we're doing is. And I think I've seen people who wear buttons that say, get out of your own way. You know, we get in our own way by wondering, well, am I doing the right thing? How are people going to judge me? And we will be judged and there will be consequences. But if we just forget about that and think like Gandhi and Nelson Mandela and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Martin Luther King, people who put the self-consciousness aside for the greater good. I know that's not exactly what the flow state is, but I think when we get out of our own way, we're in a much better position to be in that state of unself-consciousness.
Okay. That is all of our questions for this evening. So I will turn it back over to you, Julie, to conclude the program.
Thanks, Sean. And thank you to Bill Coleman and Jeanine Hathaway for tonight's presentation. That was a delightful conversation about stories and myth and poetry and reinvention.